Okay, so with the Detroit Red Wings having such a poor season and having a 12-game losing streak, I thought it would be kind of fun to look at some of the records held by NHL teams. Now, I've had to go back from the 1949 to 1950 season because that's what the internet gave me to look at for records, which was the easiest way to research. And some records do date from the 50s about defence and goal scoring. So it shows how the league has changed so much since the original six were just the only teams in the league till now with 31 teams. There's been some massive changes in the league. And also there's some pretty embarrassing records on this list that certain fan bases would wish you didn't look at. Now, Detroit had a losing streak of 12 games this season. They don't make the board in negatively on this board at all. Some of their streaks are pretty good. Some of their records are pretty good. But I'll start with the most points and we'll finish with the fewest goals against. That's how we're going to work it. And it covers every era from 1950 through to now. So the original six era plus the early expansion era through to the dead puck through to now. Some really interesting stats on this board. So the most points in a season is 132 by the Montreal Canadiens in 1976-77. And when we have the debate about the greatest team of all time, people say Edmonton, the Islanders, the Montreal Canadiens from the mid-70s. Scary. 132 points in a single season. That's a regular season. Now, bearing in mind, obviously, now we have the shootout and overtime losses. Back in the 70s, we had ties. So the three-point game has changed how, points are awarded. But 132 points, and they didn't have to rely on a lot of ties to get that 132 points. There was a lot of wins in there. Very few losses. That is how good this Montreal team was. If that Montreal team, with the record that they had, were to play today, would the overtime loss and shootout, would that affect things? That's hypothetical, because that means the shootout wasn't a thing back then, and overtime was different. So hypothetically, could that record be broken? It is theoretically possible if the Washington Capitals keep up the pace they're continuing and go on a very lengthy win streak in the second half of this season. Yes, that record could be broken. Could. Unlikely, but could. So, Washington Capitals fans, you're on this board for all the wrong reasons. You could be on this board for the right reasons next season if you carry on with the form you were showing. But with the three-point game, with overtime losses and shootout losses and how they're awarded by points, it could be interesting. But 132 points in the regular season by the Montreal Canadiens, 76-77. Possibly the greatest team of all time, if we want to have that debate. The worst team of all time, and there is no debate about this, is the Washington Capitals of 1974-75 with 21 points. Even the San Jose Sharks, who were also equally bad in the early 90s, cannot equal how bad this team was. And San Jose appear on this board for that bad team, but the Washington Capitals are 74-75. So the season, or 2 seasons before Montreal break all the point scoring records, Washington set their own 21 points in a season. Detroit fans, you're lucky, you're not that bad. The most wins in a season. Now this is where Detroit fans can go, we have a positive record. 62. 95-96. 62 wins in a season. You hold that record alongside Tampa Bay, who also equaled that record last season with 62 wins. Now, the playoffs that season, Detroit went on to have a good playoff run. Tampa got swept. So just because you have a good regular season doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do well in the playoffs. So President's Trophy winners, that curse, it's a thing. But 62 wins in a regular season is pretty good, and I can see that possibly being equalled or broken by possibly the Washington Capitals this season. There are some teams that regularly chalk up the wins and don't require a lot of overtimes to do it. That's why these two teams were very, very good. They didn't require a lot of overtimes or shootouts to get those 62 wins. So you have to look at the records of what they had, and it's terrifying how efficient they were in regulation. The fewest wins in a season, we go back to Washington in 74-75 with 8. 8. Even the terrible San Jose team of the early 90s wasn't as bad as this Washington team with 8 wins. This is where you look at the greatest and worst teams of all time. Washington Capitals. This debate's been had in the comment section before, but the Washington Capitals, every time for me, the worst team of all time. 8 wins in a season. The most shootout wins, so this gets interesting. So this is now the modern era, so post-lockout of 2004-2005, so the last 15 years, we can look at this. Edmonton with 15 in a season, and they were quite a good, decent side in the mid-2000s with the Edmonton Oilers. Quite a decent side. They got to a Stanley Cup final. 15 of their wins in 2007-2008 came via shootout. That's 30 points they picked up by winning in shootouts. So think of it pre 2004-2005, they would have been ties. They would have lost out on 15 points, and that would have affected where they finished, obviously, in the standings and seedings and playoffs. The shootout helped Edmonton that season. The most shootout losses, and this is where the 3-point game, the New Jersey Devils of 2013-2014 had 13 shootout losses. So, skills competition, New Jersey sucked that year. Let's be honest, because it's a skills competition, the shootout, really. It's the skill of the attacker and the skill of the goaltender, one-on-one. So the Oilers and the Devils, opposite end of the spectrum, with the parity in the league right now, with the salary cap as it is, and a lot of teams vying for playoff positions, I don't think you'll see these records broken anytime soon. There's less shootouts now than what there were because of 3-on-3 overtime rather than 4-on-4. So with the change in the overtime, it means there's less shootouts in the season. There's still a lot of shootouts, but I don't think you'll see one team win 15 in a row and one team lose 13 in a row. I think these records are safe. And unfortunately for Devils fans, that's a record you don't want. The most losses in a season, and this is where the debate of the worst team of all time is 71 by the San Jose Sharks in 92-93. Yeah, Washington got a few more draws that year. They were bad. 71 defeats. Bearing in mind this is an 82-game schedule. That's pretty bad. Pretty bad by San Jose. Yeah, I don't know what you do with that. But Detroit fans, you're safe. You're not that bad. You're bad, but you're not as bad as San Jose. That is 71 defeats in a season. That is that's something, isn't it? I don't know what you can say to that. The fewest losses in a season, on a positive note, again, that great Montreal side from 76-77 with 8. 8. That is terrifying if you're the opposition, knowing that you're going to play a team, home or away, who don't lose, and who also, there's a lot of goals scored by this team as well. They're not the top goal scoring team of all time, I will say that, but they're in the top 5 for goal scoring as well. They were a terrifying team, and this is before the 80s free-flowing lack of defence, scoring for fun. Even the crap teams were scoring 200-300 goals a season. That Montreal side was a machine. So if you're the away team or even the home team, you've got to know, Christ, we have a 10% chance of getting a win. That's the odds you had. A 1 in 10 chance. That is how terrifying this Montreal team were. They were a unit. They were a machine. The longest win streak. Now this is something I was actually quite surprised about. The Columbus Blue Jackets in 2017-2018 had a 19-game undefeated win streak. That includes overtime wins as well and shootout wins, but 19 games where they came out the victors. And yes, the 3-point game pre-2004-2005, that there would be some ties in there with overtime, obviously, because there were some shootout wins, but 19. Again, if you're a team playing the Blue Jackets in that spell, you got to look at it and go, Christ, we're going to get slaughtered here. Let's try and take them overtime and get a point. That's terrifying when you're coming against a team that's had that kind of win streak and knows how to win 19 games in a row won. It's terrifying. The longest losing streak, and this is where the two worst teams on the board come up again, this is where the debate of which team is worse, 17, split between the Washington Capitals in 74-75 and the San Jose Sharks in 92-93. These teams were bad. So the bad Senators team, Ottawa Senators team from the early 90s, San Jose, worse than that. Washington Capitals, worse than that. So when we look at the Ottawa Senators having some pretty shocking seasons as well in the early 90s, San Jose were worse. And there is the debate, is that original that expansion Ottawa Senators team from the early 90s one of the worst of all time? Yes, it's one of the worst, not the worst. I think it's almost a split tie at this point about how bad these teams are. 17 losses in a row for both teams. Bearing in mind, again, pre-overtime losses being counted, so this is in the tie era. That is how bad they were in regulation. These sides lost a lot. Again, so if the Columbus Blue Jackets, for example, were to go in and play one of these ties, if hypothetically, when you're on a win streak like that and you're coming against a team that can't win, it's something that you must have felt for the players on these teams, and they were bad, just bad. And the goaltenders as well, they must have been facing a shooting gallery. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. San Jose do not have the worst defence of all time. No. This is where we can categorically say the Washington Capitals were the worst. The most goals for in a season was 446 by the Edmonton Oilers in 83-84. This is the Wayne Gretzky era. This is the only 80s record on the board. That is interesting. Really surprised that is the only record from the 80s since 1950 that has made it onto the board. Is the Edmonton Oilers scoring the most goals in a season in 83-84. Really surprised by that. Not surprised is the 50s records, the fewest goals for 133 by the Chicago Blackhawks and 53-54. So you look at the Washington Capitals and San Jose Sharks being really bad. The Chicago Blackhawks in 53-54 scored less goals than those two teams. So goal scoring has evolved. And you'll look at the fewest goals against and fewest goals for in the 130s and the 50s. So low scoring league back then. Because the fewest goals against 131 for both Toronto in 53-54, same season as Chicago, and Montreal in 54-55. Goal scoring very, very low. Not a lot of goals scored back then. However, the most goals against, and this is where we can confirm the Washington Capitals of 74-75 being the worst team of all time. 446 goals against. So it's basically like they're playing the Edmonton Oilers every day for 82 games. Because in 82 games, Edmonton scored 446. In 82 games, the Washington Capitals conceded 446 goals. Yeah. The Capitals in 74-75 is possibly the worst team of all time. The Oilers in the 80s, free scoring, defensively not so good. So their for and against record for goals for and against is not as great as you think. And their actual regular season record is nowhere as close as Montreal in 76-77, Detroit and Tampa in 95-96 and 2018-2019. It's the only record from the 80s on the board. That is what is really surprising. Although Edmonton got on the board twice, and it's weird. They're very good at the skills competition apparently, and they're very good at goal scoring in single seasons. But they don't get on here consistently. Montreal are on here consistently. Washington Capitals are on here consistently. The San Jose Sharks are only on here twice, and that's with loss streak and most losses in a season. So if you look at that. Okay, they're bad. The Washington Capitals, however, the ties are actually worse. They had less ties than San Jose. San Jose managed to stick in games enough to get some points together. You could say San Jose Sharks from 1993 are the second worst team of all time. So when we look at the Colorado Avalanche a few seasons ago, or Detroit right now, they're nowhere near as bad as San Jose or Washington. And the Washington Capitals of 74-75, for me, worst team of all time. And I will do a more in-depth look at that 74-75 season and go, oh Christ, how bad was this team in a separate video. Same with San Jose. I'm going to do a separate video on that bad season. And I'm going to look at the worst seasons for each individual franchise and see how bad the Capitals and the Sharks were back in the 70s and the 90s. But thank you very much for watching. This has been a really interesting video, and there's actually some video ideas for each franchise to look at the teams right now. Because some teams have moved, like New Jersey originally were Colorado Rockies, for example. The Winnipeg Jets were originally Atlanta Thrashers, and they've got a bad record in there on team records that I didn't put on the board because I ran out of space. There's a bad home losing streak in there. Ooh, that's shocking. And a bad away losing streak as well. The Atlanta Thrashers weren't great either. Obviously, the Calgary Flames were the Atlanta Flames, so some teams have moved. So I'm going to look at franchises and their worst and best seasons. But thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much indeed. And place your comments below if you are an NHL fan, and if you think you can find some worse records of whatever team you follow in whatever ice hockey league or any sports professional league, please feel free also to add them in the comments. I know there's some out there. I've done some videos on some pretty bad teams like the Western Suburb Magpies in the NRL. They were bad. I don't think they were this bad. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll have some more videos for you very, very soon.